There are stories people think they understand the moment they see them. A short clip, a headline, a comment section full of certainty. And just like that, a life becomes a conclusion. But some stories resist that. Not because they are mysterious in a cinematic way, but because they are laid in a way most people do not take the time to examine. This is one of those stories. For years, the Whittaker family has been reduced to a single idea, a label repeated often enough that it begins to feel like the full explanation. But labels are not explanations. They are shortcuts, and shortcuts remove context. So before anything else, something needs to be made clear. This is not a story about spectacle. It is not a story about shock. And it is not a story that can be understood by isolating one detail and ignoring everything else. Because what happened here is not the result of one decision. It is the result of accumulation. Over time, across generations, under conditions most people will never experience. Now consider where this actually begins. Not with a viral video, not with a filmmaker, not even with the town most people associate with the story. It begins much earlier, in a structure most people never examine closely. Family lineage. Because when people hear the term inbreeding, they tend to imagine something simple. Close relatives, repeated patterns, gradual consequences. But this case is not simple. It contains a specific genetic configuration that changes how the outcome should be understood. And that configuration centers on something most people overlook. Identical twins. Now pause there, because this is not a minor detail. Identical twins are not just siblings. They are genetic duplicates, which means that from a biological standpoint, they carry the same genetic code. Now consider what happens when two identical twins each have children. Those children are not just cousins in the usual sense. They share a much higher percentage of genetic material. And when those children form a union, the genetic distance between them is not what people assume. It is significantly reduced. Now take that one step further. If that pattern produces multiple children, the effect compounds. Not gradually, but sharply, because the genetic overlap is already elevated from the start. Now ask a simple question. What does that do to the probability of inherited conditions expressing themselves? It increases it, not slightly, but significantly. And that is where the concept of genetic collapse begins to make sense. Not as a dramatic phrase, but as a description of probability converging into outcome. Now consider the scale. 15 children, each one carrying the weight of that genetic structure. Now think about variability. Some individuals may retain more typical function. Others may not, because genetics does not distribute outcomes evenly. It distributes risk, and risk expresses itself differently in each individual. Now pause again, because this is where interpretation often goes wrong. People see the outcome and assign judgment. But the outcome is not the decision. It is the result of conditions set in motion long before the individuals affected had any control over them. Now consider what that means for understanding. It means that what people often describe as strange or shocking behavior is not random. It is rooted in biology, in environment, in limitation. Now move from genetics to environment, because genetics alone does not explain everything. It interacts with conditions. And those conditions matter. Now picture the setting. Rural isolation. Limited access to structured support. Minimal external intervention over long periods. Now ask what that does to development. If individuals with significant challenges are raised in an environment with limited resources, what happens? Adaptation occurs, but not in the way outsiders expect. Because adaptation is shaped by what is available, not by what is ideal. Now consider communication. If formal language is difficult or inaccessible for some members of a household, what happens? They develop alternative systems. Gestures, sounds, patterns, repetition. Now ask the critical question. Are those systems random, or are they structured within the context of that household? The answer is they are structured, but the structure is internal, not external, which means outsiders do not recognize it. And what is not recognized is often misunderstood. Now think about the sounds that became the focus of public reaction. Grunts, barks, vocalizations that did not align with conventional speech. To an outside observer, they appear chaotic, but within the household, they may carry meaning. Not standardized meaning, not transferable meaning, but functional meaning. Now pause again, because this is where perception becomes important. If you do not understand a system, you may assume it has no structure. But that assumption says more about the observer than the system. Now consider what happens when that internal system meets the external world. It is not translated. It is judged. Now move to the next layer. Protection. Because this household did not exist in a neutral environment. It existed under pressure. Not constant media attention at first, but something more direct. Local intrusion. Curiosity that crossed into harassment. Now ask what repeated intrusion does to a household already under strain. It forces a response. Not theoretical, practical. Now consider what that response looked like. Defense. Not symbolic, physical. Now ask why. Because when external systems do not provide protection, people create their own. And that is what happened here. Neighbors became part of that system, not as passive observers, but as active barriers. Now think about what that means. A household surrounded not just by isolation, but by enforced boundaries. Outsiders discouraged, sometimes forcefully. Now ask how that shapes perception. From the outside, it appears extreme. From the inside, it is necessary. Now consider what that does over time. It creates separation, not just physical, informational, because fewer people enter, fewer people observe, and the story becomes fragmented. Now move forward. Years later, the barrier is crossed. Not abruptly, gradually, through repeated visits, through familiarity, through persistence. Now ask what happens when a previously closed system becomes visible. It does not present itself in a controlled narrative. It appears as it is. And when it does, people react. Not analytically, emotionally. Now think about the first widespread reactions. Shock, discomfort, curiosity, judgment. Now ask what those reactions are based on. Surface observation, not context. Now consider what gets lost in that process. Everything that explains how the situation came to exist in the first place. Now step back, because this is where the story actually begins to take shape. Not as a viral moment, but as a laid structure. Genetics creating conditions, environment shaping adaptation, isolation limiting intervention, external pressure triggering defense, and eventual visibility distorting understanding. Now ask one question before moving forward. If you remove any one of those layers, does the story remain the same? It does not, because each layer contributes to the outcome, and ignoring any of them leads to a partial understanding. Now consider what comes next, because what has been described so far is only the foundation, the origin, the structure. But what happens when that structure is exposed to sustained attention? What happens when a private system becomes public? What happens when value is assigned to visibility? And what happens when that visibility attracts more than just curiosity? That is where the story shifts again. Because exposure does not only reveal, it changes. Comment one word. Context if you think understanding the background changes how the story should be viewed. Or outcome if you believe what people saw is all that matters. Because the next part moves into what happened after the world started watching, and why that may have altered everything that followed. When a story crosses from private to public, something fundamental changes, not just in how it is seen, but in how it behaves. Because once attention enters a system, it becomes a variable, and variables change outcomes. So now the question becomes precise. What actually happened when the Whittaker family stopped being hidden and started being watched? Most people think they know the answer. Exposure brought awareness. Awareness brought attention. Attention brought help. That is the simple version. But the simple version is incomplete. Because attention does not arrive alone. It carries pressure, expectation, interpretation, and sometimes opportunity. Now pause there, because that last word matters more than people admit. Opportunity, not always for the people at the center of the story, but for those observing it. Now consider the moment of exposure. The footage circulates. The reactions begin. Millions of people see something they do not understand. And when people do not understand something, they try to categorize it. Quickly, often inaccurately. Now think about the categories that emerged. Shock, curiosity, pity, disgust, sympathy, and something more complicated. Fascination. Now ask what fascination does. It sustains attention. It keeps people watching, returning, sharing. And once attention sustains itself, something else follows. Value. Now this is where the story changes. Because once a situation generates value, it begins to attract actors. People who want to help. People who want to document. People who want to interpret. And people who want to benefit. Sometimes all of those overlap. Sometimes they do not. But they all enter the same space. Now consider what that does to a previously closed system. It opens it, not just physically, but socially. Now ask a practical question. How many people can interact with a vulnerable system before it becomes unstable? There is no exact number, but there is a threshold. And once that threshold is crossed, patterns begin to shift. Now consider the Whittaker household at that stage. Already operating under limited structure, already managing complex needs, already adapting to internal communication systems. Now introduce external input. Different people, different approaches, different expectations, different interpretations of what help means. Now ask what happens when those inputs are not coordinated. They conflict, not always visibly, but functionally. Now think about routines. Routines are stability, but routines depend on consistency. Now introduce inconsistency. Visitors arriving at different times. Interactions varying in tone and purpose. Food patterns changing. Attention levels fluctuating. Now ask what that does to a system dependent on predictability. It destabilizes it. Not immediately, but gradually. Now consider another layer. Narrative control. Because once a story becomes public, it does not belong to one person. It becomes distributed. Different people tell it in different ways. Now ask what happens when those versions conflict. Confusion increases. Trust decreases. And the people at the center of the story are often the least able to correct any of it. Now consider the role of documentation. Cameras, videos, updates. Now ask what documentation does. It captures, but it also shapes behavior, because people behave differently when observed. Now ask a more difficult question. What happens when observation becomes expectation? When people expect to see certain interactions, certain emotions, certain outcomes. Now think about pressure. Not explicit pressure, but implicit. The sense that something needs to be shown, explained, updated. Now ask what that does to a household not built to manage that kind of demand. It adds another layer of strain. Now consider the individuals inside that system, each with different capacities, different thresholds, different ways of responding. Now introduce variability. Now ask what happens. Some adapt, some withdraw, some become more reactive, some become quieter. Now consider how those responses are interpreted externally, as personality, as behavior, as content, but internally, They may be responses to instability. Now move to another dimension. Resources. Because attention often brings resources. Donations. Supplies. Support. Now ask what happens when resources arrive without structure. They become difficult to manage. Not because they are unwanted, but because management requires systems. Accounting. Distribution. Planning. Now ask whether those systems were in place. If not, what happens? Confusion. Misallocation. Suspicion. Now consider the next step. Conflict. Because where there is value and ambiguity, conflict emerges. Now think about competing claims. Who is helping? Who is responsible? Who has access? Who has authority? Now ask what that does to the environment. It fragments it. Because instead of one consistent structure, there are multiple competing ones. Now consider the effect on the household. Multiple inputs, multiple expectations, multiple narratives. Now ask what that does to stability. It reduces it. Now move to something more subtle. Stimulation. Now think about sensory input. More people, more voices, more movement, more unpredictability. Now ask what that does to individuals sensitive to environmental change. It overwhelms, not always visibly, but physiologically. Now consider cumulative effect. Not one visit, not one interaction, but repeated exposure over time. Now ask what that leads to. Fatigue, irritability, inconsistent behavior. Now consider how those are interpreted externally, as part of the story. But internally, they may be signals. Now return to the idea of intention, because this is where misunderstanding often occurs. Most people entering the situation likely believed they were helping, and many were, but intention does not equal outcome. Now ask a precise question. Can positive intention produce negative effects in a complex system? Yes, especially when actions are uncoordinated. Now consider the broader environment. Online discussion, comment sections, speculation. Now ask what that does. It amplifies everything. Now think about how quickly narratives can shift. One update, one claim, one interpretation. Now ask what that does to stability. It introduces external pressure that the internal system cannot control. Now consider the role of trust. Because trust is the foundation of any support system. Now ask what happens when trust is uncertain. People hesitate. Decisions become inconsistent. Now consider the cumulative effect again. Genetic vulnerability, environmental limitation, isolation, sudden exposure, uncoordinated support, conflicting narratives, increased stimulation, resource mismanagement. Now ask a simple question. What does that combination produce? Instability, not as a judgment, as an outcome. Now return to the present, because what we see now is not just a reaction to one event. It is the result of all of those layers interacting over time. Now ask the key question. Was the exposure itself the problem? Or was it the lack of structure around that exposure? Because those are different conclusions. Now consider what structured exposure might look like. Controlled access, coordinated support, clear boundaries, consistent routines. Now compare that to what actually occurred. Now ask what the difference would be. Stability versus variability. Now consider the next phase. Because once instability reaches a certain point, systems respond. Not based on narrative, but based on conditions. And that is where intervention enters. But before that intervention happens, there's always a period where signals are present but not yet acted upon. And that period is where the most important changes occur. Not publicly, but internally. Now ask one final question for this part. If the same attention had been structured differently from the beginning, would the outcome have been different? Comment one word. Yes, if you think structure could have changed the trajectory. No, if you believe the outcome was inevitable. Or partial if you think it would have helped but not solved everything. because the next part moves into what happened when those signals could no longer be ignored, and why the response that followed changed everything. There is always a moment in every unfolding situation where observation turns into action. It does not arrive with noise. It does not announce itself. It begins quietly. A note, a report, a pattern recognized by someone trained to see what others overlook. And once that moment passes a certain threshold, the system changes. Not gradually, decisively. Now ask the question most people never ask. What actually triggers intervention? Not rumors, not arguments, not public opinion. Those create pressure. But pressure alone does not move systems. What moves systems is evidence. Patterns that repeat. Conditions that meet criteria. Risk that becomes measurable. Now think about what that means. It means that long before anything visible happens, something has already been building. Quietly. Consistently. Now return to the Whittaker environment at that stage. Multiple variables already in motion. Instability, inconsistency, external attention. Now add one more layer. Observation by professionals. Not viewers, not commentators. People trained to assess risk. Now ask what they look for. Not spectacle, not narrative. Indicators, behavioral shifts, environmental conditions, care patterns. Now consider something subtle. A single event rarely triggers intervention. A pattern does. Repeated signals, accumulating over time. Now ask what those signals might look like. Changes in routine, increased agitation, withdrawal, fatigue, inconsistent care structure. Now consider environment, physical space, structural integrity, hygiene, safety. Now ask what happens when both behavioral and environmental signals align. Risk classification changes. Now pause there, because that is the turning point. Not public, not dramatic, but decisive. Now consider what happens next. Documentation, assessment, verification. Now ask what that leads to. Decision. And once a decision is made, the system acts. Now think about how that action appears from the outside. Sudden, unexpected, but in reality, it is the result of a long accumulation. Now consider the emotional reaction of observers. Shock, confusion, questions. Why now? What changed? But the better question is different. What had been changing all along? Now move to the moment of intervention, because this is where perception and reality often diverge. From the outside, it can feel like removal, separation, disruption. But from a systems perspective, it is stabilization, an attempt to reduce variables. Now ask what stabilization requires. Control, structure, consistency. Now consider what that means in practice. Reduced external access, defined routines, monitored care. Now ask what that does immediately. It lowers unpredictability. Now consider the individuals within that system. Timmy, Lorraine, Ray. Now ask what happens when unpredictability decreases. Responses change. Not instantly, but noticeably. Now think about the reports that followed. Calmer behavior, more consistent patterns, improved engagement. Now ask a critical question. Did those changes come from new abilities or from a new environment? Because that distinction matters. Now consider Lorraine. Previously existing in a space of constant variation, now placed in a structured environment. Medical oversight, consistent routine. Now ask what that does. It reduces internal strain. Now consider Timmy, sensitive to changes in environment, now placed in predictable conditions. Now ask what that produces. Stability. Now consider Ray, adjustment speed noted as faster than expected. Now ask why. Because adaptation is easier when variables are controlled. Now step back. Because this creates a difficult realization. Improvement after removal does not automatically mean failure before. but it does reveal something. The previous environment was not sustainable at that stage. Now consider the most misunderstood element. Responsibility. People look for a single point, a person, a moment. But complex systems rarely fail because of one factor. They fail because multiple pressures converge. Now consider Betty, central to the system, providing care, maintaining structure, managing everything. Now add external pressure, attention, visitors, expectations. Now ask what happens when one person carries increasing load without support. Capacity declines. Not suddenly, gradually. Now consider what professionals observed. Fatigue, irregular patterns, signs of overload. Now ask a precise question. Is overload a failure or a limit being reached? Because those are not the same. Now consider the decision again. If the central support structure collapses, what happens to everyone dependent on it? They collapse too. Now the decision becomes clearer. Intervention is not just about individuals. It is about preventing system-wide failure. Now move to something deeper, because there was another layer, less visible, but critical. Environmental deterioration. Now think about the physical space, not as background, but as a factor. Structure, safety, where over time. Now at increased activity, more movement, more pressure. Now ask what that does to a fragile structure. It accelerates decline. Now consider what professionals would see. Risk not just from behavior, but from surroundings. Now combine both. Behavioral signals, environmental risk. Now ask what that creates. Urgency. Now consider the reported health scare involving Timmy. Subtle, but significant. Now ask why that matters. Because it confirms that the system has reached a point where internal strain is manifesting physically. Now the threshold is crossed. Now intervention is no longer optional. Now it is required. Now return to the emotional layer, because this is where misunderstanding becomes strongest. Supporters feel relief. Improvement is visible, but also discomfort, because improvement raises a question. Why was it not like this before? Now consider the honest answer. Because the previous environment could no longer support it. Not because there was no care, but because the conditions exceeded capacity. Now consider what happens after intervention. Structure replaces variability. Consistency replaces unpredictability. Now ask what that produces over time. Recovery. Not complete, not perfect, but measurable. Now consider the next development. Visitation discussions. Now ask why that is introduced carefully. Because reintroducing variables too quickly can reverse stability. Now consider what that means. Even positive interactions must be structured, timed, managed. Now ask what that reveals. Stability is not just about removal. It is about controlled reintroduction. Now step back again. Because the story has shifted from exposure to instability, to intervention, to stabilization. Now ask the question that remains. What happens next? Because intervention is not an end. It is a transition. Now consider possible paths. Reintegration, long-term structured care, hybrid systems. Now ask what determines that path. Sustainability, not narrative, not preference, but what can be maintained without collapse. Now consider the broader lesson, because this is no longer just about one family. It is about what happens when vulnerable systems encounter uncontrolled attention. Now ask one final question. If the intervention had been delayed, what would the outcome have been? Comment one word. Better if you think more time could have improved things. Wise if you think delay would have increased risk. Or unknown if you believe the outcome could have gone either way. Because the final part is not about what happened. It is about what remains. And what responsibility looks like after the crisis has already unfolded. Now everything slows down. Not the story, the judgment. Because once the noise fades, What remains is not outrage. It is consequence. The Whittaker situation did not end with intervention. It transformed from chaos into structure, from visibility into distance, from constant access into controlled silence. And that shift is uncomfortable because it removes the audience. Now ask the question most people avoid. Was the attention helping or destabilizing? Because the final state offers a clue. Stability appeared only after exposure decreased, not disappeared completely, but reduced, managed, filtered. That does not mean attention caused everything, but it does mean it had weight, and that weight mattered. Now consider the people at the center, not as symbols, not as a story, but as individuals inside a system that exceeded its limits. Timmy, Lorraine, Ray, Betty, each carrying different forms of pressure, each responding in ways the outside world could only partially see. Now the structure around them has changed. More predictable, more controlled, less visible, and that creates a final tension. Because the audience always wants closure, but real situations rarely provide it. Instead, they leave something quieter, a question that does not resolve easily. What does responsible support actually look like? Less access, more structure, more distance, or something harder to accept, knowing when to step back completely. Comment one word. Stay if you believe continued attention helps. Step back if you believe distance protects. Because what happens next will not be decided by noise. It will be decided by what remains when the noise is gone. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.